Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Candid Talk, being broadcast under the aegis of Prohor.in. My name is Avik Chanda. Today's session is entitled Coping with COVID. And as the title suggests, that is what we're going to talk about. The myriad ways in which it has disrupted not just the economy, not just our lives, but everything about the world that we have come to know and probably that we take for granted. And then we talk about ways and means of coping with a final aim to succeeding. We have a stellar cast of panelists. First up, we have Bernard Dietsch, who's joining us live from France. Now, Bernard he wears multiple hats. He is a senior journalist and interviewer with Forbes. He's also the founder and CEO of T4X, which is at the conjunction, if I understand it correctly, of expertise, business, and online solutions. So, Bernard, we start off with you. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Bernard, as I understand, you divide your time mainly between mainland Europe, between France and the US, New York. Now, both of these have been big epicenters of the global pandemic. So where you are right now, how do you see the situation overall at the moment, globally?
Well, the situation is a bit different when you compare between the US and France, because France, we are confined, but this is compulsory. Okay, the government asks you basically to be locked in. You can go out like 1 hour a day to do shopping, etc. But the economy went completely down here in France. US is a bit different. You are strongly suggested to stay home, but this is not compulsory. Here, if you don't comply with the rules, you get a fine. In the US, not. The situation here is all the economy is definitely harmed. I would say that probably 95% of the people work remotely, but this is a complicated time.
Absolutely, for all of us. And if you're talking in particular about the European economy, a large part of that has to do with travel, to do with tourism and associated industries. Now, with the lockdown, particularly, at least for now, around interstate, intercountry, and international travel, do you have any kind of a prognosis as to how badly that sector is going to be hit, and how much of a time it would take for those kind of sectors to actually get out of the rut that they're currently in?
Well, this is a complicated question because at this stage it depends on several factors. The first one is when this pandemic is gonna stop, okay? When the borders will be reopened, when people will be started traveling again, and it really depends on the trust. And of course, it depends on the business they're gonna have, because the people won't travel if there is no business. Up to now, for instance, if I want to take the French, and I would say the European countries, all the rules are completely different. But if I take like from the French perspective, I would say that we're pretty locked. Next week, you'll be able to walk as you want within like 100 kilometers away from your home, but you cannot go further. It means that if I decide to go for a weekend on the Riviera, which is about 1,000 kilometers away from here, I won't be able to do anything. So still, for some times, the moving will be very, very restricted. So I think the economy will be, to answer the question, the economy will be very slow for some time. Yeah.
And in terms of the morale on the whole, because you talked about trust, and a big factor is the morale of people. So the people that you're talking to, or the people that you see, maybe the stray acquaintance, what are they saying? What's the level of morale like? Are people very dejected, or are people looking forward to the time when they can start to have some semblance of normalcy again?
Whether it's in the US or in France, I would say that the people that I talk to are sort of resilient. For in France and US, it's a different situation. France is because the government has poured about 600 billion euros in the economy to support the company. We have the possibility, if you have in a French company, to put like people in an employment system, and the government pays most of the salary. So like that, they make sure that we're not going to fire anybody. In the US, in general, the government voted to special subsidiaries called the PPP, which enable the companies during 2 months to have a total support on the operating costs, salary, etc. So definitely, it's really helping. The people today, they're like in complete expectation. They don't know where they will be going. They don't know if that's in the future it will be an opportunity or not. And I would say it completely depends on the type of activity you have, because obviously, if you're like in technology today, of course, you have more chance to get job, and maybe you will have more business in the upcoming years. Whether that when you're like in a travel industry, obviously it's going to be a different story.
Okay, right. So Vena, we are going to come back to you in a bit. Going from the global economy to the Indian economy. At the moment, what's happening in India is, if you look at the initial phase of the lockdown, the whole purpose was to arrest the growth and contagion of COVID-19. And the motto that we used at that point of time was "Jaan hai to jahan bhi hai." If our life is preserved, then we can, then the world is ours going forward. Now, I think there's a subtle shift, or maybe not so subtle shift, of the narrative. It's saying Jaan bhi, Jahan bhi. So we not just need life and sustenance, we also need the economy to get moving again. But in any case, it is Jaan, or life, that comes first in this narrative. And that's where I would like to bring in Dr. Fuad Halim. So Fuad is a very seasoned senior medical practitioner based out of Kolkata. He's a philanthropist, he's a scholar in his own right, and he's also a politician. So today we are going to steer clear of the politics, because there's been enough of that, even when you're talking about testing kits and people making a racket and people making money. My question to you, to begin with, is very simple. Let us talk about our readiness. So as a medical practitioner, as a representative of that discipline, where are we in terms of readiness today? Please.
Avik, I believe that the lines are pretty disturbed, but what I understand that you're asking of me is to give a perspective from the medical, what do you call, outlook as to how we are looking at COVID-19. Where I think so, looking at a post-COVID situation, we will be actually trying to, what you call, learn some lessons. And maybe the most fundamental lesson that we are going to learn post COVID-19 is that we have been trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of healthcare time and time again. You see, the lessons that we learned in our battle against smallpox was squandered. The lesson that we learned recently when we actually conquered polio were also lost. And we are going to relearn those lessons. And unfortunately, we are going to relearn those lessons from the misery that the people of our planet are going to suffer. Now, what were the lessons we learned when?
Okay, we seem to have lost Fuad there for a minute. We'll get back to him when he's back online. So in the meantime, all right, let's give it a minute. Okay. There seems to be some technical problems. And what I've learned, having been in technology and technology advisory for about 20 years, is wherever you have technology, you always have to be ready for a glitch. Let's move for a little bit from Jan to Jahan, the world, the resources, the economy. And I'd like Dr. Amit Kapoor to join us here. So Amit is the head of the CEO of the Institute for Competitiveness, and he sits on the think tank of various public policy-making bodies, and he works with private as well as public sector corporates. He's also a visiting faculty at Stanford and Harvard. So Amit, welcome. Talk to us about Jahan. Where are we in terms of the Indian economy? And remember,
this is a very this is an important question that we are really grappling with as of now. You started the conversation with this very important point, and that was that, of course, it was either about life or livelihoods. I think as a country, we made a very concerted action that we said, we are going to be talking about life, we are going to be saving life, and that is what was done. And from an economy point of view, I think what has happened is it is across the world that we've just come into something like a standstill. You just hit a wall, and then everything across the world has come to a standstill. So if you really look at it, like looking at some economic figures and everything, the fundamental thing is going to be that how long would this effect last? If you're really talking about any kind of production or any kind of economic growth, it is not really happening. You're effectively at a 0% rate of growth or rate of movement right now. So how long would it actually take for us to really move forward? The question is that for every week of lockdown, it might actually end up taking you something like close to about 4 weeks for revival. But I think this is not a very big cost that we have to pay, looking at the kind of loss of life that would have actually happened because of this pandemic. So it was always about loss of life and loss of economy. Economies always grow and move out. In fact, you have to learn from history as well. If you really look at the last pandemic that actually happened in the world exactly about 100 years back, that was the Spanish flu. India lost close to about 20 million people in that pandemic, anything between 15 to 20 million people. So 2 crore people lost their lives at that point in time. At that time, the population for India was just about 25 crores. Today, we are 130 crores or 1,300 million people. At the peak of the pandemic, assuming the rate of death that we are actually seeing, 5% of India's population could have actually been lost. So it was just not right. It could have actually been youth, it could have been old, or whatever. It could just have been a very broad spectrum disaster. So now we're looking at a economic situation. Economic revival will actually happen. But what we are seeing is that you would see a huge shift in terms of like how economies are actually going to pan out or how things would actually play in the future. From my point of view, like one of the things or the biggest things that's going to happen is deglobalization. And deglobalization is that people will actually start thinking about reorienting their value chains, moving their what I call manufacturing systems from one part of the world to the other part of the world. They are actually going to make them more adaptive, more resilient, and so on and so forth. So if you really look at it, this is an opportunity for India. So India could actually see a lot of movement in terms of, say, the companies operating in China coming to India and seeing that whole thing happening in terms of a positive viewpoint. From a domestic viewpoint, I think India has a certain level of resilience in terms of like how domestically we will actually move ahead. India has always been a very strong internal consumption market. And I see that this internal consumption will actually drive itself forward as we really open up the economy. We will take some time to really rev up. We will take about close to 6 months to 12 months to really come back to normal. And normalcy is actually going to be a long-term thing from an economic viewpoint. But it is typically going to be a U-shaped recovery, as a lot of people will ask that question. So you would see that recovery, but then the question is going to be that how the economy pans out. So, and how people will start spending. In fact, if you learn from China, there was something very interesting that happened in China, and that was revenge spending. And that was on the within the first week of opening up, on one of the days, Hermes sold $2.7 million worth of purses. So are we going to see some revenge spending here as well? So you might actually see that there could be some super rich out of this country who will just go out and just go to Tanishq store or probably go to Tumi stores and whatever, and just go berserk in terms of buying something. So that might actually happen. But these are very early days in terms of like how things are really going to be. But overall, things are going to change. How we live, how we work, how we play is actually going to see a permanent shift in the world. In fact, I think there is going to be a fundamental shift in terms of like how we actually work from places. Today, when you talk about, say, migration, there is a migration that has happened. There is a reverse migration from cities to villages. Is it that people are going to come back to cities very quickly? No. So you might want to actually see a huge, or you might see a huge shift in terms of how people will actually look at working, how they will actually telecommute. So those are the set of things that would actually happen. So this is a huge bearing for states and cities and how the value proposition of these locations will change. So all in all, very, very interesting times. But I see a huge positive in terms of how reorientation will happen. And this is also about bringing those structural changes that India has actually been waiting for a long time.
Okay, great. Let's talk about some of the potentials for positive. And you mentioned China. In that context, there is this discourse prevalent at the moment, right? There's this narrative which says, look, China has lost its goodwill equity, its goodwill capital, its political capital. Everybody in the world hates China. Therefore, much of the manufacturing is going to come to India. Now, are we being too naive when we just think that therefore it's going to come to us? Or is it something that we have to do and step up big time in terms of our processes, in terms of our efficiency, in terms of our cost structure, in order to actually be able to take advantage of that?
Avik, this is just a great question, and you've hit the nail on the head in terms of what India needs to do. I don't think it is going to be automatic in terms of saying that everybody is going to run away from China and come to India. There are other sets of places who are going to be competing. In fact, it is location versus location which is competing. It is going to be Thailand, it's going to be Vietnam, it could be Taiwan, it could be Bangladesh. So all those places are going to be competing for vying the manufacturing opportunity that exists. So what India needs to do is that India will have to really reorient its efficiencies, its whole productivity game that you're really looking at. What is it that we are able to offer to the enterprises who are actually looking at coming into the country? It does not mean that you have to give support or you have to give tax holidays. What it means is that can I actually promise absolutely great watertight contracts that can actually exist? There are states in this country who have actually rescinded on their contracts. So can we actually say that India is actually going to be focusing on very watertight contracts which are going to stay? We need to do that. Can I actually provide the right quality of electricity? Can I actually create a system wherein movement of goods is actually fairly easy? Today, one of the biggest challenges in India is movement of goods and movement of people. And I'm talking from a normal standpoint, not in COVID era. I'm talking about a normal India when it actually operates fully. So if you really look at it, so how do we actually enable movement of goods? The other thing which we have to look at is that the cost of land for creating factories. It's fairly exorbitant. The cost of land in India is fairly exorbitant. So how do we actually reduce that prices? How do we actually look at moving into a situation that enterprises don't see land cost as 50% of the cost of the project? So you have to really reduce that as well. So how does that land parcel open up? And how do we look at the whole thing? And then last but not the least, it's about electricity and electricity cost. In fact, if you really compare the cost of doing business in India today vis-a-vis the cost of doing business in Bangladesh, the cost of doing business in India is much higher vis-a-vis Bangladesh. It is also the cost of finance, the cost of electricity, everything adds up, and it is more expensive to actually make things here.
Absolutely.
And in the textile sector, the exports from India are close to about $17 to $20 billion. Out of Bangladesh, it is close to about $40 billion. So that means there is something which is going right there. We need to learn from countries like Bangladesh. There is no harm in learning from a small country. Or look at what Singapore has actually done in terms of, say, attraction of investment. And let's not forget, one of the things is that one of the largest opportunities that sit in India is about entrepreneurship. I think this whole issue of COVID has also exposed something very interesting, and that is that how we have been obsessed about jobs. How this whole, in fact, the whole narrative in the newspapers was absolutely appalling. And that narrative was, oh, there are jobs which are being taken away from IIM and IIT. Guys, from my point of view, IITs and IIMs should actually ban placement cells. They are not placement agencies. They need to actually be agencies which actually create entrepreneurs. So this is what should have actually happened. And we are not talking about it. We always talk about the wrong set of things. People have taken away their jobs. Come on, those are enterprises. Create your enterprises. Don't be job seekers, be job creators. And that's what needs to happen. Open up your mind. This is an opportunity to make a difference to the world. Create solutions. Don't be followers of something that is actually happening outside and some big enterprise who can actually chuck you out.
Right. So, Amit, again, we'll come back to you, but one more, I think, very important follow-up question here. You talked about resilience. Now, resilience is essentially a psychological attribute. It's a tenet, but it's not necessarily a function of the markets. In a paradigm where people are losing jobs, it's a matter of time. I mean, we are under the aegis of the Disaster Management Act, and there is a government mandate that there should not be wage cuts and there should not be retrenchment. But you and I both know that behind the scenes, some of that is already happening. And at some point of time, when the lockdown goes up, there'll be a number of companies, particularly in the MSME sector, who will say, look, we just don't have the working capital. So unless we have a specific subsidy, we are just going to go bust. We will not be able to sustain ourselves. So what's the prognosis there? Because if you're looking at the unemployment rate, it was 8%, then it's 24%, 28%. By the time we reach the 17th, it's anybody's guess what it could be, but it's probably going to be in the early to mid 30s. So what is the way around that in the short term, if any?
So like this is again a very important question. I absolutely agree with you that in the short term you are actually going to see huge sets of problems from an unemployment perspective. You're being very optimistic in terms of saying that it is actually going to be low 30s. I suspect that unemployment would actually be touching about 40% as we actually go along it. And the question here is going to be that 97% of the employees or employment is generated by the MSME sector. Yes. So what needs to happen here is that this is where government would actually have to come into supporting the MSME sector. In fact, the kind of support that is required would actually be very high. It could be up to about 5 to 6% of India's GDP. We will have to do away with our whole fiscal deficit targets and everything and move ahead into that direction. So support is going to be required. Support is going to be required in terms of loans at a lower rate to create working capital and so on and so forth. So let me give you an example. Say a franchisee store is typically not able to generate revenues, and he's going to have a bad time for at least the next 6 to 8 months. So one is that government can support them, but in this case, I would also invoke an idea in terms of saying that corporations should also be supporting that. In fact, the large, say, retailers are typically franchisee retailers. Are the corporations supporting them? The large corporate who's actually the franchisee, he should be the franchisor, he should be supporting these guys as well. So that is what needs to happen. So corporates will actually have to create something what I would call as the capitalistic dharma and follow that. And government would also have to support it. But all in all, I think once this really gets into motion, if we are able to really get into a system wherein we are able to create that support for MSMEs, you would see a hockey stick growth in terms of employment numbers. And that is what is going to happen. It is not going to be that we are going to be stuck around with that 30%, 35% job loss. It is going to be a very quick, comeback in terms of picking up the threads here. The only thing which I worry about is in terms of the migration that has actually happened. The worry is that the reverse migration that has actually happened and people have moved away from cities to say villages. How quickly will they come back? How quickly will migrants come back? I think migrants have actually got scared. They feel that they will get exposed to this kind of a pandemic again or whatever, and they might not want to come back. So you might actually feel certain set of labor shortage in a certain set of sectors. So how do you really tackle that is going to be one of the big challenges.
Absolutely. Fuad, we lost you earlier in the program. Just to come back to you, just talk to us about the state of readiness from the perspective of medical facilities and healthcare.
Well, Avik, you see, I'm a little bit frustrated in this entire experience of COVID-19 from the point of view that we are having to actually reinvent the wheel all over again. And the question of reinventing the wheel is as simple as looking at what you call, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
You can hear me. Yeah. So, like we learned some humongous lessons in 1919, the influenza pandemic, and we built on those experiences to actually challenge smallpox and eradicate smallpox. We extrapolated those advantages when our fight against polio. But what we did after smallpox was actually plan and globally decide, because the Alma Ata Declaration in 1978 was a global conclusion of all the health ministers of the world, that you need to have a robust public health system globally if you're if you're going to challenge diseases that are pandemics. Smallpox was a chronic pandemic, tuberculosis is a chronic pandemic, polio was globally present. But by the time we came to the 90s, we lost that argument, and we tipped in favor of the International Monetary Fund and the what you call the World Bank prescription that you need to pay for health services that you're going to get. Now, the one of the what you call repeated experience that we are having in COVID-19 is that private healthcare has no role to play when public health issues rise to a peak like COVID-19 pandemic. It's evaporated. The private healthcare structure is absolutely evaporated. Now, it's frustrating for me because we'd already learned those lessons over the past 150 years of our experiencing, and we are learning to reinvent the wheel once over again. Now, if you look at the contrast I'd like to say is like we chose not to sell the smallpox vaccine. That's to take a very reductionist view of how public health should be arranged. But just for making conversation simple, we did not sell the smallpox vaccine. We won our battle. We sold anti-tubercular medicines. And look at the mess that we are in now. In 1955, not a single tubercular bacilli was resistant to any medicine, to streptomycin that was discovered at that point of time. And today, 65 years down the line, the tubercular bacilli is resistant to every drug that we have produced. So we've lost advantages over this what we call debate into whether health should be in the private domain or whether the profit should be allowed, whether commerce should be allowed in health, or it should be purely a public what we call institution. COVID-19 is definitely going to create that realization among the people globally that there is no space for what you call the private healthcare infrastructure in times of acute crisis, and hence there should be no space for them when we are in normal times, because it is in normal times that you actually invest into your public health infrastructure and make them robust, give them traction, give them what you call reach, so that it reaches the the last what we call mile. So we've not done that for our public health infrastructure, and I think so we are going to pay a very, very heavy price. America is just the tip of even having the advanced what you call medical facilities in terms of technology, but very low in terms of reach. The same we are seeing in Europe. But as COVID enters into the third world, we are going to see a very, very serious what you call impact on the populations. So I think so that is one of the cruel lessons that we are going to relearn, because we learned all these lessons previously. We're going to relearn those lessons, and hopefully we will take a decision once we go into a post COVID-19 situation that public health infrastructure has to be robust. It has to be invested in by the government, and it needs to be prepared to face challenges like COVID-19.
Yeah. So Fuad, let's get into some specifics. Let's talk about testing, right? I'm not going to get into whether the test kits were sold at a premium and who was making money on the side or what was faulty, etc. Purely in terms of numbers, what is the kind of testing that we should be doing ideally per day? First talk about West Bengal and then the country. And then in that ambit, tell us where we're at and what the shortfall is.
You see, Avik, it's very difficult to actually predict what number of tests are correct at this point of time for states and regions of India which are actually moving up the curve. But if you look back in retrospect and look at Kerala, Kerala has done about close to somewhere around 2,000 tests per million. And what they've done with that advantage of doing those number of tests is that they have actually reduced the spread of the disease. And they have now almost reached, I think so today, with the fourth consecutive day where they will be getting 0 cases. On the other hand, there are 2 varieties of tests. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritties of that. But at this point of time, Bengal is way behind on the testing schedule in terms of India. And India is way behind in the subcontinent itself. Countries like Bhutan, they've crossed 13,000. Maldives has crossed 14,000 per million. We've got Nepal that's crossed 2,000 per million. Pakistan is way ahead of us in terms of what testing we are doing nationally. But then if you look at the national figures, they also skewered to a couple of states. They skewered in favor of Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Delhi. And those are the states which are doing a huge number of tests, because primarily they did not screen the inflowing traffic that landed in from international, what you call what you call flights. And that's the price we are paying. Had we, COVID-19 entered India through the airports. There is no other route through which COVID-19 has entered into India. And had we been cautious enough to monitor our airports, I think so we could have gained some advantage. Having said that, we have already lost that traction. We already know we are not on the same page in terms of figures that have been put out by the Niti Aayog. The Niti Aayog was predicting a peak on the 27th and 28th of April, and the first week of May they were predicting that we'll be going down. Today, in the first week of May, we are almost 3 times the figure what the Niti Aayog had predicted that we would peak at in April. So the graph is not going down. The graph is going in a hockey stick fashion upwards as far as India is concerned. The regions that are outside, as I said, the 3 major states that are testing, that's Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Delhi, the average figures are very low. So I think so. If you give me a rule of thumb, I think so at this point in time for India, I think so Kerala would be the yardstick. We should be doing. We should have already achieved about 2,000 tests per million, and to gain some traction. And we have about 1,000 off that figure at this point of time. And I think so to achieve that as soon as possible would give us some semblance of trying to get the infected population along with their contacts away from the susceptible population. The entire game of pandemic, what you call mathematics, is to get the people who are infected and their contacts away from the people who are susceptible. So you can identify them either as people with disease showing symptoms, or with disease but not symptoms, or asymptomatic. So that can only be achieved by major testing. So I think so we are way off the mark as far as testing is concerned in India by 50%.
Okay, and in terms of the way forward, right? Because we're talking about COVID, just coping with the pandemic as it stands today, and we are also going to talk about what we have when the economy opens up again. Because sooner or later, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 weeks, and we don't want to speculate, but the conditions are going to be relaxed. The lockdown is going to be lifted. At that point of a time, I don't think it's in any case, left to reason or left to question whether or not we are in stage 2 or in stage 3. As you pointed out, the sheer numbers are showing us that definitely we have entered the paradigm where we have community spread. What is your biggest fear at that point of time? Once the economy opens up, once the lockdown does, all of the people, right, be they self-employed people, be they salaried guys, be they business people, they're going to scramble, my guess is, to try and make up for the lost time. They're going to say, okay, now I'm going to go all out and still try and do the best I can in terms of meeting my, deliverables, meeting my targets. When you have that huge amount of outflow of people onto the streets, maybe not malls because they will be shut, maybe not airports, they will be shut, but on the streets, in front of shops, in the offices, how do you suppose that A can be regulated, and B, if we have a huge spike at that point of time, which really dwarfs whatever we had.
I didn't get the whole question, but I get the drift of what you're asking me. There's some connectivity issues at my end. So what I understand is that the moving away from the lockdown and the quarantine will not be a purely medical decision. It will be motivated by economic reasons than for what you call medical requisites being fulfilled, and that's the balance that's going to unfortunately blow up, because the advantages that we were supposed to accrue during this 40-day lockdown period, we have not accrued that advantage because we are already in the upswing. And we may have delayed the peak in India, but unfortunately, if we do not ramp up the testing, given our limitations in continuing with the economic lockdown, we are going to have people engage with each other, and we are going to see a severe vertical explosion in numbers. And as I said, that can only be contained if we actually ramp up the number of tests that we are doing. And with this fine balance in terms of whether coming out of the lockdown will be motivated by medical consideration or by economic consideration. Unfortunately, my mindset is very clear. Given the present dispensation, it's not going to be a medically oriented decision. It's going to be more what you call favoring the economic side of it. And people are definitely are low down in terms of the cash reserve. The poor are in a very precarious position. So the government should come in and give a huge subsidy to these people to sustain them if they want some semblance of the lockdown to what you call persist beyond what they're planning at this point of time. But if they do not give money in the hands of the people will definitely have to come out and participate in economic activity to sustain themselves. So that's the unfortunate dilemma that we are in India at this point of time facing.
So Fuad, certain things are very clear, right, in your viewpoint. One, we may have been able to avoid the huge spike or a huge peak across the economy because of this lockdown and the extended lockdown, but we have certainly lost some advantages. But in terms of testing, and if you're looking at the figures purely from a West Bengal standpoint, and you're looking at the average of the last 5 to 7 days, at the best of times it has touched or just crossed 2,000 tests per day, and at other times it's lagged behind in about 1,200, 1,500. That's been the kind of rate. So even if that is double, okay, my guess is the first thing that you will see is because you are actually testing the number that you should have been all along, the number of cases is just going to blow up. And maybe not in unitary method, but exponentially. And in that kind of a scenario, how are the hospitals, how are the medical facilities geared up to be able to even admit COVID patients?
Well, Avik, at this point of time, if you look at the COVID figures, then globally the first profession to be affected are the healthcare workers. The second are going to be the policemen. The third are the journalists. So that's the breakup. If you look at in terms of professions, and the healthcare workers are going to be affected. So that's going to create severe constraints. The private sector has basically evaporated in front of the COVID-19 onslaught. It's nowhere to be found on the ground. And it's sad that even in cases of the non-COVID-19, what we call patients, they are also not being able to access services from the private sector. And that leaves behind a very threadbare, public health structure, which is not only going to be stretched to its seams, but I think so you're going to have pictures that we saw seen in Italy. We've seen people on the roads in front of hospitals. We've seen beds and what we call, we've seen mattresses being laid in between beds in Italy, in Spain, in what we call in parts of America. So we're going to have an overstrained what you call public healthcare system working with unpreparedness, because in our good times we've not invested in our public healthcare system.
Yeah, and if you're talking about the supply chain, one part is the infrastructure. When you're talking about the facilities, you're talking about ventilators, you're talking about ICUs, you're talking about masks and PPEs. The other huge part of the supply chain is the actual talent. And early on in the lockdown, there was a discussion I remember where Dr. Devi Shetty was saying, look, get all the interns, get all the final year MBBS or MD students, get them, give them a provisional certificate and get them to hit the ground running. Make that part of your army for going out there and solving the medical crisis. So would you sort of agree to that viewpoint? Is that one way of stepping up the preparedness?
Well, you could nationalize the private healthcare system, and Spain has done that. Spain has actually included. We've seen a recent order that's been issued yesterday in Maharashtra, where they've given a call to 27,000 practicing physicians in the private sector to report to the government, and they would like to include them into a system. So in a way, you're seeing this a response system globally, also in India, where the private sector is being integrated into the public health system under a unitary command to face the challenge of COVID-19. How that will play itself out is very difficult to what you call what you call, it's difficult to assess at this point of time. But I think so. That's a valid suggestion, because you have these resources there, and
Mhm.
you need to integrate it. In certain parts of West Bengal, there are certain private sector hospitals which have been they've been recruited for handling COVID-19 patients under government supervision, and I think so that needs to be expanded. And as you mentioned, that there are final year students, that there are nursing students. There have been bad experiences also. We've seen where in Howrah particularly, where nursing students were sent to the front line without any training, because the senior people in the healthcare, in that healthcare facilities, were reluctant to go into the front line. So there are pluses and minuses. I think so. If you have command system to get people who are untrained into the system just as cannon fodder, I think so that would pay less dividends than create more trouble. So definitely the potential is there, but it has to be a very well thought of mechanism to actually include them and utilize them. Do we have an alternative, Avik? Frankly, we don't have any alternative. This is the only way ahead. I hope that we do it appropriately, correctly.
Right. Fuad, thanks very much for your views. We'll try and get back to you with some more questions, time permitting. We talked about deploying the final year students, right, and giving them some kind of tuition license. Now that brings us, we can sort of turn the lens now, talk about final year students who are preparing for their board exams, and their lives have been completely disrupted. I mean, there is never a good time for a situation like this, not possible by definition. But this couldn't have come at a worse possible time for them, for people who are doing their board exams and some of their papers are still left, and for people who are about to join college, join the institutes of higher education, and then get forward onto a platform where they can start off with life. I think it's fair to say that the entire system around education sectors, you talk about students at the school level, at the college level, and also working professionals who would otherwise be updating their knowledge in terms of executive education. And in that context, Santosh, so Professor Santosh Sangem is essentially a finance guy. By training, he's a finance guy and he's an economist. But a large part of his day job today is as Associate Dean of the Virtual Interactive Learning, or put it simply, online education system at XLRI. So, Santosh, talk to us about the disruption that students as well as the education institutes are facing in this time of pandemic.
Mm, See, to be honest, the way I see it is most educational institutes are quite clueless about how they should go about handling it. So if you look at it, there are a lot of if you look at the situation, you can break it down to what we call as a short-term response, as a long-term response. Short-term people are just struggling, trying to find a workaround, like having having teachers take some online sessions from their homes, tying up with Coursera, all of that kind of stuff, you know, to somehow tide over this and get rid of the students who are there in the system, right? But what people are failing to understand is that yes, you're creating a short-term, you're having the short-term response here, but the whole landscape of education is going to change drastically post-COVID. If you actually look at it, COVID situation has, you know, shown people that online education, okay, or rather, education as the way we used to see it, itself has started changing over the last couple of decades. See, if you recollect it, maybe during our parents' time, you just finished all your studies at one go. That was the end of it. And then you work for the rest of your life. Don't really bother much about continuing education. The last 2 decades have already made continuing education a very important, you know, or a necessity for everyone, right? Now, what's probably going to happen is there's going to be a lot of uncertainty about what kind of skill sets, etc., people will need going forward. Okay. So one side, one part you can say, yeah, the traditional skill set, right? But a lot of new industries, new ways of doing things will come up, and for a few years, people will be a bit clueless about what they should be doing in terms of upskilling themselves. Now, this is one thing which I see happening in the short term. The way education institutes will respond, especially Indian education institutes will are responding to the short term is let's somehow get this thing done with, right? And what they're failing to recognize is that long term this will be both an opportunity as well as a big threat, right? An extremely big threat only, given that Indian educational institutes are in general slow in adapting to change. That's a hard fact of life, right? Now, with the growing acceptance of online education, right, there will be a change in the way we have to look at education in terms of how we design and how we deliver it. All of that has to happen at the internal end. Fine. But the bigger challenge is that the moment there is an acceptance of online education, it opens up the possibility of foreign institutions, okay, offering their undergraduate education in India through the online mode. In fact, most people in India are still not aware of the difference between a live mode of teaching, which is somewhat similar to what we're doing, right, versus a recorded way of teaching as what is done in Coursera and so on. So going ahead, in the next, if the foreign universities recognize this opportunity, going ahead, it's going to be an extremely tough time for undergrad education in India. Okay, because that's probably one place where they're going to get a competition which we have not expected. Till now,
Mhm.
foreign universities, one of the reasons why they were resistant to come was they had to set up their facility in India, give their, uh, have their own infrastructure, have their own faculty, etc., be physically present. But once those boundaries get blurred, right, the whole landscape is going to change. And that's where Indian education institutes have to seriously think about the future of Indian education and even the guys at the policy making level, right? So I think that's one big change that
Right.
challenge that we're going to see.
So Santosh, just to interject here, you're talking about the real possibility that Ivy League colleges or universities across the world will come in a big way and enter into the Indian market at the undergraduate level, and that obviously poses a huge disruption as well as a huge challenge for the existing education institutions. Even before we get there, just talk about the short-term problem that we're facing at the moment. So, for example, let us assume that you have a whole number of courses learning, right, running at the moment. And because XLRI or maybe a few of the other premier institutes have been doing that for a long time, so you are much less at a disadvantage. But think of the tier two, tier three kind of institutes. Talk to us about the challenge where overnight, because of the extended lockdown, which may persist for a while yet, we have to not just shift from the point of view of the faculty. It's easier for a faculty to do that, but the entire technology, the entire methodology, entire approach has to shift from an in-person education to an online mode. What are
Yes.
the challenges from a supply side standpoint? It could be studios, it could be technology, it could be the kind of technology that you're using, and whether or not that is robust enough, whether that's safe enough. Because what you don't want to be doing is using Zoom and then disseminating information that's proprietary material, right?
Yeah. Okay. As you pointed out, technology is definitely an issue, but there are too many technology solutions. The biggest, problem for tier two and the smaller institutes is actually going to be the fact that most of the faculty are never taught online, and teaching online requires a completely different approach, right? And overnight, you can't expect your faculty to adapt, to it soon. So you have to, you know, work on things like probably restructuring your courses or, readjusting the content, and trying to find out more ways to engage the students by changing your content. Okay. And that's one of the big challenges, because we're talking about addressing it short term. Infrastructure is not a problem for the delivery point of view. We have thousands of softwares which can allow you to stream and manage classroom in secure ways. The second challenge is going to be the fact that we don't have a very good internet connect penetration in India. So the students who are watching the sessions, they are the guys who will probably end up facing issues. There will be many of them with poorer internet connectivity, and they will lose out, right? So how do you manage the requirements of those students? So I think it's, if you look at it in the short term, it's these two things. On the supply side, I would say technology is not a constraint. Yes, there are financial constraints for investing in technology, but to be honest, the cost, if if institutions plan and schedule their sessions properly, the added cost of technology is not significant. Okay, the major hurdle is going to be on the side of the faculty, and the second constraint is going to be on the side of the learners in terms of what kind of internet pair connectivity they have. In the short term, this is what's going to happen. So
Going from the shorter term to maybe a medium term here, Santosh,
yeah.
over time, give it 3 months, 6 months, as online education not just takes over, but becomes the new norm, the new usual, if you will, what is the probability that going back to the old norm of congregation where you have 80 people or 100 people listening to your lectures when you're taking a banking course, is that going to be a thing of the past? What's your view there?
I don't think it will be a thing of the past, because what we'll probably see going forward is that there'll be a mix of blend, or what we call as blended education. There'll be a mix of live, online classes, a mix of physical classes, right? Because if you look at it, uh, faculty will still not leave the old ways, and even if you're in India, till as of now, the mindset is that yes, a physical program is probably much better, right, than an online program. That is something which has been ingrained into the Indian mindset, right? Although that mindset is changing, but there that is still a big chunk. So I think that mindset change will not happen in 3 to 4 months, right? So going forward, if you look at it next 3 to 4 months, I don't personally see that academic institutions can actually have physical classes for quite a few months going down the line. So in fact, as is there in the case of the US and other countries in Europe, right? They've effectively declared that the entire academic year is going to be online. We might actually end up seeing that possibility in India, wherein the next academic year across schools, colleges would be online. So that's the harsh reality which education institutes have to face.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, we've just got to keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best, that disruption brings out the best in us. Amit, I'm seeing a number of questions coming in from our viewers around the economy. In particular, we started talking about aviation, entertainment, travel, tourism. All of these are going to be badly hit in the short term. What I also do know, coming from that fraternity, is a number of the IT companies, or if you're talking about IT, consulting, KPO, BPO, are also hit in a very bad way. So, what's the prognosis for them? Because many of them would want to cut wages. Many of them would probably have no wherewithal but to execute a mass retrenchment once the lockdown gets lifted. What's the way around that, if any?
So if you really look at this is a very important question for certain set of sectors. If you really talk about, say, aviation or tourism, anything which is related to tourism, it's not going to be easy for any one of these sectors. It is actually going to take a lot of time for these sectors to emerge. I would suspect that we are talking about a 2-year window before travel and tourism starts picking up. Or effectively, like a lot of people will get scared and feel that we will only go out once the vaccine is there. So we are talking about a good 12-month to a 24-month window before travel or normal travel starts. So business travel will initiate itself in the next few months, in say 3 months, 4 months, or whatever. But it will be a fairly light load, and it's not going to be tourism travel at all. So economies which are based on tourism, or even locations which are based on tourism, are going to have a very, very hard time. And then having said that, these sectors will take a lot of time to come back. Say the aviation sector, all the airline companies, like they are going to face one of the hardest times in the world. In fact, we are talking about a situation which is going to be worse after the 9/11 crisis for the aviation sector, because nothing's going to be moving. The seats that you will actually have to fill up will probably get filled up at 30% or 40% of your capacity, because you'll have to have those social distancing norms. Prices will be high. Only what do you call the travel which is important is going to happen. So tourism and things are really going to take a lot of time. But if you really ask me, things like say BPOs and everything, I'm a lot more positive there, because once things start kicking out, in terms of say once economy starts picking up in a small way, the businesses come back into action. BPO or whatever, say the banking will come up, and after the banking comes up, your support systems will happen, and the BPO, the KPOs will start happening. So anything which is related to services of this nature will happen first.
Just to interject a little bit there, Amit. As we know, right, there's usually a gestation period or a lag of maybe 2 to 3 quarters, right? Now, going back to what Bernard said right up front, if the economies in the Western world are at a standstill, and that is much of the business coming to us, notwithstanding the domestic market that we have, much of the business that comes to the IT companies, vast majority of it comes from the West. And if that is at a standstill, maybe that will pick up after another 2 quarters. But in the meantime, because of that lag, maybe 3 or 6 months down the line, there's going to be a huge spike of not upward movement and not recruitment, but actually of retrenchment.
Oh, definitely. That is why I said in the beginning as well, you are far more optimistic when you say that only 30% unemployment is going to happen, or low 30 figures. I suspect that the unemployment figures are going to be much higher, because it is only now when people will start reorienting their businesses, they will start seeing that there is no demand. Say, a lot of these things that a lot of companies do could actually end up being as a discretionary spend. So when you talk about funded research, or say think tanks or whatever, they're all discretionary spends. Like enterprises will stop supporting. So that's the same story for the what do you call the BPO sector and so on and so forth. So you will actually see a lot of what do you call reduction in revenues. So this is where enterprises will actually have to be very careful, and they will have to say, we're going to cut our cost like crazy. I think this is the time when people will have to start questioning as to what is the right model. What is the CEO salary? There has been this debate, like what is the difference that needs to happen? Like if you really look at enterprises in India, say typical CEO for a retail enterprise makes more money than a retail store holder, the profitability of a retail store that he actually has. So if you really look at it, you will have to start questioning those kind of models, because those kind of models will not work. So you will have to get to you have to reimagine capitalism in ways that we have not really thought about. And it does not mean that I'm talking about you'll go back to socialism or whatever. You'll have to reimagine capitalism in such a way that you say that corporations become far more reasonable in terms of how they operate, how they actually present their products and things.
And in terms of that reimagining, right, in terms of ethos, a lot would have to do, when you say reason, I think that has a lot to do with empathy. It's time that the big corporates right up front, from the top guys, start becoming far more empathetic and talk about, if not the high tide of socialism, at least a more equitable share in terms of, if there are wage cuts, for example, that has to start right from the top, and that has to be much more at the top, etc. So we are coming towards the end of our program, and Bernard, we started the show with you, and we'd like to come back to you towards the end here. We talked about the broad spectrum of the sectors, the economy, different kinds of vocations that are held. But at a very intrinsic individual level, every single one of us is affected. I mean, here was a time where in the second decade of the 21st century, mobile technology was a thing of the past. IoT was a thing of the past. We are talking about AI and deep machine learning and taking everything to the next level. And something like this just stops us completely in our tracks. I mean, more than 350 years ago, the French mathematician, scientist, philosopher, Pascal, right? He raised the question, what should I do now? Qu'est-ce que je fais maintenant? At a very existential level, what does it mean for an individual? How do we cope with this at an individual level?
Well, I think right now is it's what am I doing now and what am I going to do in the future? Okay, and the key answer to that, and I'm sure that within like in the last 2 months, a lot of people wonder is basically if they're going to have a job in 2-3 months from now. Okay, that's probably the first question. The second question is what's going to be the purchasing power? Because as it was mentioned previously, the wages may go down. You know, yes, maybe some people will be a little bit more reasonable than it used to. The other thing too is I think there is like a big room for education, because the key stuff today, we were talking about unemployment, and a lot of jobs that are needed today won't be needed tomorrow. Okay, and if you want to avoid unemployment, the key point is to have a strong education program or educational program, school or online. You know, I don't know, like a lot of companies has started, like new startup companies has started to create some program in order to educate people in IT, in medical, etc. I think in the coming future, you will have like a lot of education on, online, and I think the government will be sort of forced to help those companies. Otherwise, they will have like tons of unemployed people in the street with the risk behind. Okay, so that education is going to be the key stuff for the upcoming months, you know, because the government can pour like zillion of euros, zillion of dollars in the economy, but if people are not educated, you know, they won't have any job. So the other thing too is the economy, which is moving from mortar to click. A lot of sector of activity used, you know, being digital was like a sort of nice to have situation. Now it became to a must have situation. This shift within like 2 months, okay, 2 or 3 months, whether it's luxury, I can quote LVMH, who has like the sales are absolutely booming online, or, you know, very simply groceries. You know, the store, the online orders went up like crazy as well.
Yeah. And probably when you're talking about education, there are two parts to it. One is obviously the new mode of education, the new technology, which has suddenly become a must. But there is probably also another part of that education. We have been trained for technologies X, Y, and Z. So tomorrow we can go into another alphabet, like an alpha, beta, gamma, and start training ourselves. But we, as a species, have not necessarily been academically trained for resilience, for grit, for self-efficacy. And resilience is something you point out right up front. So maybe there is not just introspection, but formalized education around that, which is needed.
Yes, this is gonna be the new black. That's definitely a new thing. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I see
on resources. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks very much. I see that we've just gone over stoppage time. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our esteemed panelists here. Dietsch, Santosh Sangem, Fuad Halim, Amit Kapoor. It's been an absolute pleasure. And viewers, hope this was helpful. Hope this was useful. Hope you have some takeaways and much food for thought. I'll see you all same time next week. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Avik. Thank you.
Bye.